The morning sunlight filtered softly through the curtains of my modest two-story home, casting a warm glow across the polished hardwood floors. I sipped my coffee in silence, enjoying the gentle hum of the smart blinds as they adjusted to the rising sun. It was another Monday, and like clockwork, I was already logged into our dev team's Slack, answering questions before most of my neighbors had finished their first cup of tea. That was the rhythm of my life. Quiet, predictable, efficient. I was the guy who kept to himself, nodded politely at HOA meetings, and paid my dues on time without ever making waves. As a senior systems engineer for a cybersecurity firm, my life revolved around control. Control of code, systems, and vulnerabilities most people never imagined existed. But outside of work, I preferred to live without friction. I wasn't interested in small talk, barbecues, or the endless complaints that filled the HOA group chat. My neighbors knew me as the guy with a clean lawn, minimal holiday decorations, and an obsession with keeping the Wi-Fi router in the optimal central location. In truth, I liked it that way. The HOA didn't know much about me, which was fine. I'd volunteered once, years ago, to help them set up the community-wide security system. Gates, smart locks, cloud-based camera feeds. It was a free favor, and I never brought it up again. They assumed the vendor handled everything. I never corrected them. After all, I wasn't interested in credit. I just wanted a quiet life. I didn't know that morning would be the last time I walked out of my house using my own front door key. I didn't know the HOA had plans for me. And I certainly didn't know they were about to make a mistake they'd regret. The morning unfolded with its usual sense of calm. I brewed my coffee just the way I liked it. Strong, black, no sugar, and tapped through the overnight alerts on my phone. Most were server logs from a client in Tokyo, routine stuff. I packed my lunch, glanced at the weather app flashing a warning about scattered showers, and grabbed my jacket just in case. My car started with a comforting purr, and the neighborhood looked as serene as ever. Dogs being walked, sprinklers ticking rhythmically, and the usual jogger waving as I backed out of the driveway. There was nothing strange, nothing that set off alarms in my mind. Not yet. Work was intense, but familiar. Code reviews, vulnerability patching, a new penetration test suite my team was implementing. I was so buried in tasks that I barely noticed the missed call from an unknown number, or the notification that one of the smart locks had been accessed from a new device. Normally, I would have checked that, but the morning's demand left no room for distractions. I silenced my phone and buried myself in lines of code. By noon, I had completely forgotten. It wasn't until late afternoon that a creeping feeling of unease began to settle in my chest. I was wrapping up a call when I noticed 3 voicemails. One from the number that had called earlier, one from a neighbor, and one from the HOA itself. I played the one from my neighbor first. Her voice was hushed, like she didn't want to be overheard. "Hey, just thought you should know. There's a locksmith at your place. I asked the HOA what's going on, and they said they're rekeying your front door. Something about non-compliance. Just thought you'd want to know." I blinked. For a second, it didn't register. Rekeying, while I was at work. Surely that had to be a mistake. I scrambled to play the HOA message. The president's voice, clipped and smug, filled my ear. "Mr. Harris, per Article 9, Section 3 of the Community Code, the board has decided to enforce lock replacement due to your repeated non-compliance notices. Access will be restored upon review of your appeal. Thank you." I stared at my screen in disbelief. They changed my locks. Not a warning. Not a fine. They had physically altered the security of my home while I wasn't there, and they had the audacity to act like it was just business as usual. My pulse quickened, but I kept my expression flat. Years of working in security had taught me how to remain calm under pressure. But beneath that calm, something stirred. Something cold, calculating, and resolute. The HOA thought they were dealing with another passive resident. They thought they could throw their weight around without consequence. What they didn't know, and what they would soon learn, was that the locks they had changed were part of a system I had designed. And I never build anything without a way back in. By the time I pulled into the driveway, the sun had dipped low enough to cast long shadows across the lawn. My house looked unchanged from the outside, standing there in perfect suburban stillness, like nothing had happened. But I knew better. I stepped out of my car with a strange mix of disbelief and dread humming beneath my skin. The mailbox held nothing unusual, just junk flyers and a water bill. It was almost insulting how normal everything looked. I walked up to the front door, fishing my keys from my pocket as I'd done 1,000 times before. I inserted the key and turned. Nothing. It stuck. No give. I tried again, jiggled the handle, stepped back and checked the door itself. New lock. Different color. Slightly shinier metal. Not mine. I stood there for a moment, key in hand, like someone caught in a bad dream trying to wake up. It didn't work. The truth was hard and sharp, digging in deeper with every second. My home, my safe space, had been tampered with while I was at work. Violated. I knocked. No answer. I didn't expect one, but I knocked again just to hear the sound echo through the place I no longer had access to. Across the street, an older neighbor, Mrs. Caldwell, peeked from behind her blinds. She gave a faint wave, then disappeared. A few moments later, a compact SUV pulled up. I recognized the HOA treasurer behind the wheel, and from the passenger side emerged Carla Jennings, the HOA president herself. She walked toward me with the confident, clipped steps of someone who thought they had the moral high ground. "Mr. Harris," she began, in that polished tone reserved for customer service or courtrooms. "We took measures today under full compliance with the bylaws. Your home was rekeyed due to ongoing violations. You've received multiple warnings." I didn't respond right away. I just looked at her. Her pressed blouse, the smug way she clutched her HOA-issued clipboard, the self-satisfaction radiating from every pore. I finally asked, "What violations?" "Improper flowerbed modification. You installed solar lights without submitting Form B-17. Also, your garbage bins were visible on non-collection days. That's 3 infractions, Mr. Harris." My mouth tightened, but I remained silent. "You may appeal the decision at next month's board meeting. Until then, you are not authorized to access the property. We've secured it for community standards." She handed me a typed notice and turned back toward her car without another word. I watched her leave, the tail lights vanishing down the road, the anger inside me growing cold and focused. They believed I was powerless, just another resident they could control with fine print and overreach. But I wasn't powerless. I had designed the system that watched this entire neighborhood. I had built its digital heartbeat. And they had just made the fatal mistake of cutting out the person holding the master key. 3 years ago, the HOA was in a panic. A string of car break-ins had rattled the neighborhood, and during an emergency board meeting filled with theatrics and finger-pointing, someone floated the idea of upgrading the entire community's security. Cameras, smart locks, app-based entry for the gates, everything high-tech and future-proof. The problem, of course, was cost. Quotes from third-party vendors were astronomical. That's when I raised my hand, almost without thinking. "I can build it," I said. The room went quiet, most people blinking like I'd spoken in a foreign language. I explained that I worked in cybersecurity, had experience in smart infrastructure, and could design a full system with off-the-shelf components and custom firmware. I told them it would be secure, encrypted, and cost a fraction of the bids they were looking at. They jumped at the offer, not because they understood what I was proposing, but because they saw a free solution. I wasn't doing it for recognition. Honestly, I just wanted to stop hearing the panic in the group chat about car windows and porch pirates. Over the next 2 months, I worked nights and weekends. I mapped the neighborhood's vulnerabilities, configured routers, installed mesh nodes, and coded the back end to integrate with a central dashboard, accessible only to the HOA board, and a single super admin account, mine. The smart locks were tricky. I wrote custom firmware that allowed remote rekeying, temporary guest access, and real-time usage logs. I even added a failsafe, a private method embedded in the code that would let me override access in emergencies. No one asked questions. They were just thrilled the cameras worked, the gates opened on command, and everything looked slick on their tablets. Once the system was live, I handed off a printed manual and a video tutorial to the HOA. I set them up with limited access credentials and told them if they ever needed help, I'd be around. That was the last time anyone thanked me. Over time, the board changed, and the new members treated the system like a black box. They assumed it belonged to them because it ran smoothly. I never corrected that assumption. I had other things to worry about, and as long as everything worked, I didn't care who got the credit. But I never stopped monitoring it. Late at night, when the neighborhood slept, I'd log in out of habit, checking logs, running patches, optimizing the back end. The system was like a living thing to me, something I had built and understood, on a level no one else could. So when I stood outside my own house, locked out, holding that smug notice in my hand, I wasn't angry because I'd been excluded. I was angry because they thought they could weaponize my own creation against me. They had pulled the trigger, without realizing where the barrel was pointing. And I was about to show them just how badly they had miscalculated. The next morning, I went down to the HOA office. Not to argue, not yet, but to listen. I wanted to hear their reasoning with my own ears, to give them one last chance to prove this wasn't as petty as it seemed. The small building near the community pool was already buzzing with activity. A few board members gathered inside the glass-walled meeting room, sipping coffee and flipping through clipboards like they were handling state secrets. When I walked in, Carla Jennings barely glanced up before gesturing to a chair with the kind of politeness that barely masked condescension. "Mr. Harris, thank you for coming," she said, as if I'd been invited to tea. "Let's go over the documented infractions." She pulled out a printed form and slid it across the table. 3 items were highlighted in bright yellow. The first was a photo of my front yard, solar-powered lights lining the flower bed, neatly installed and glowing faintly in the evening dusk. "These were added without design review approval," she said, tapping the picture with her pen. "Form B17 is required for exterior lighting fixtures." The second infraction was almost laughable. A picture of my garbage bins, placed at the side of my house, not visible from the street, but technically out before the designated 12-hour window. "This violates sanitation visibility guidelines," she added. And the third was my mailbox flag, painted black instead of the standard bronze, a detail so minor I had forgotten I'd even done it. "This alters the uniform appearance of communal fixtures," Carla recited, as though reading from scripture. I leaned back, saying nothing. Not a word about safety concerns. Nothing about threatening behavior or overdue fees. Just lights, bins, and a mailbox flag. This was their justification for denying me access to my own home. These were the offenses they considered grave enough to warrant a lockout. "We understand this may seem harsh," she offered, her voice thick with manufactured empathy. "But rules are rules, and the integrity of our community standards must be maintained." I looked at the papers, then at her, and gave a single nod. I didn't argue. I didn't plead. I simply stood, adjusted my jacket, and walked out the door. They believed the matter was settled. They thought I'd been put in my place. But they had no idea that their little kingdom was built on code I had written, and that I had just decided to take a closer look at their castle's foundation. Back at my office, I sat in silence for a long time. My laptop screen reflected back a hollow expression, one I recognized from years ago, back when I used to hunt vulnerabilities in corporate networks. That same chill settled in now, not from anger, but from precision. I wasn't going to yell. I wasn't going to argue on Facebook or write a strongly worded letter. I was going to act, not out of spite, but out of principle. If the HOA wanted to play games with power, I'd remind them who installed the light switch. I booted up the encrypted admin panel I had built for emergencies. It hadn't been accessed in over a year, yet everything was intact. The interface was stripped down, clean and efficient, just like I liked it. The first thing I checked was the user activity log. Unsurprisingly, the board members had been bumbling around the back end like toddlers with a loaded firearm. Their access logs were full of failed commands, redundant queries, and sloppy overrides. That was my first green light. Then I ran a diagnostic scan on the network. Everything was online: gates, security cameras, smart locks, thermostat controls in the clubhouse, key fob registries for the gym and pool. My system monitored it all. The firmware I had written included a secure developer mode. Once triggered, it rerouted command authority from the board's front-end interface directly to my console, without alerting them. It had been meant for troubleshooting. Today, it had a new purpose. I started small. I activated the camera diagnostic loop, a tool that made all security feeds replay the last 15 seconds of footage on a loop, while continuing to record new data silently. To the untrained eye, it would look like nothing was happening. I watched their clubhouse camera for a moment, saw Carla Jennings appear on screen, then reappear, then again. Perfect. Next, I flagged the gate software to temporarily fail open. Not enough to compromise safety, but enough to confuse anyone expecting it to lock. For a few hours, every gate in the community would welcome any car, any pedestrian. The logs would show a firmware sync delay. Another minor nuisance. Subtle, legal, controlled. Finally, I created a one-time command to revoke the board's login tokens, forcing them to re-authenticate and reset passwords through a recovery system they didn't understand. To them, it would feel like a glitch. To me, it was a chess move. I didn't want chaos. I didn't want revenge. I wanted balance, respect. A reminder that when you provoke the person who built your walls, you should make sure they don't still hold the blueprint. I closed the laptop and leaned back in my chair. Outside, the sprinklers were starting up across the neighborhood, humming rhythmically as the sun began to set. The system was in motion now. They'd never see it coming. And best of all, I didn't have to touch a single line of code they hadn't already approved. By morning, the neighborhood was buzzing, and not just with lawnmowers and the usual dog walkers. Something felt off, even from the quiet of my kitchen. I sipped my coffee and tapped into the admin console. The screen showed what I expected: disarray. The entry gates had opened and closed dozens of times through the night without a clear pattern. Some residents assumed it was a software update. Others thought the HOA had lifted restrictions for a community event. But no one had answers, least of all the board. I watched as Carla Jennings attempted multiple logins to the admin dashboard, each one denied. She'd been locked out hours ago, but like a bird flying into a glass window, she kept trying again and again. The clubhouse camera feeds were frozen in the same silent 15-second loop, replaying footage of empty hallways and unmoving blinds. The HOA didn't know that the system was still recording behind the scenes. Everything was intact, just obscured. The illusion of function was complete, yet the controls were slipping further from their hands with each minute. The gym remained unlocked. The pool lights flickered intermittently. A few residents mentioned on the community forum that their key fobs had reset. Confused, not angry, yet. The chaos was just low enough to avoid panic, but high enough to expose the cracks in the board's authority. I issued another command, an automated alert scheduled to ping the HOA's internal email server. The message was brief and anonymous. System conflict detected. Please consult original firmware administrator for assistance. It wasn't a threat, just a breadcrumb. I wanted them to come to the conclusion on their own. Mid-morning, I took a walk around the neighborhood. It was a strange kind of satisfaction, watching the fallout unfold in real time. Carla was in the clubhouse lobby with 2 other board members, phones in hand, arguing in hushed tones. The locks weren't responding. The lights weren't behaving. The residents were asking questions. I passed them slowly, nodded, said nothing. Carla looked up and offered a stiff smile, but her eyes were darting, desperate for control. For a brief second I saw it, that flicker of realization. She didn't know what was wrong, but she was starting to understand who might know. I returned home, opened my laptop, and ran one last scan. No damage, no hacks, no breaches, just strategic malfunctions, all within the framework they had blindly approved. Everything I'd done was documented, reversible, and fully compliant with their original system charter. They wanted control. They tried to use the tools I gave them as weapons. But now they were fumbling in the dark, surrounded by tech they didn't understand, guided only by arrogance. I didn't need to break their rules. I had simply reminded them that the person who writes the code always has the final word. The panic didn't hit all at once. It crept in like fog, subtle at first, then suffocating. By noon, the HOA board was in full scramble mode. Residents were calling, texting, and showing up at the office in person. The front gate wouldn't close properly. Some were locked out of the gym, while others found it permanently unlocked. The pool's lighting schedule had gone haywire, illuminating in the middle of the day and plunging into darkness at night. The smart intercom system at the main entrance refused to recognize voice commands altogether. Inside the clubhouse, Carla Jennings was red-faced and pacing, flanked by 2 board members and the neighborhood's unofficial tech guy, a teenager who had once bragged about jailbreaking his gaming console. He tapped uselessly at a tablet screen, offering suggestions that involved unplugging the router and hoping for the best. It was clear they were in over their heads. Password resets didn't work. Recovery emails weren't arriving. The console interface had defaulted to emergency lockout mode, a feature they didn't know existed. Word spread fast. The residents, once mildly annoyed, now questioned everything. Why weren't there backups? Why had no one consulted a professional? Why was the HOA so unresponsive? I watched it unfold on the community's private forum, a place usually reserved for lost cats and bake sale announcements. Now it brimmed with suspicion and frustration. And then someone finally said it. Didn't Harris build this system? Just like that, the tide began to shift. Not in a dramatic public way, but quietly, subtly. A few neighbors started glancing at me differently. A couple of them knocked on my door to ask if I knew what was going on. I said very little, only that I'd heard things were acting up. But deep down, I knew the board had started to realize the truth. They weren't in charge anymore. The knock came late in the afternoon. I was expecting it. When I opened the door, Carla Jennings stood on the porch, her usual poise dulled by fatigue and frustration. She held her clipboard like a shield, though the paper inside was creased and damp at the corners. Her expression flickered between forced professionalism and quiet desperation. "Mr. Harris," she began, her voice lower than usual, no trace of the clipped superiority she'd used days before. "May I come in?" I stepped aside and let her in. She didn't sit, just hovered near the entryway, eyes drifting to the smart lock on my door, now restored and blinking green with quiet approval. She seemed smaller in this space, as though the air itself recognized the imbalance. We're having some issues, she admitted. The system seems to be malfunctioning. We can't access the admin controls. Residents are complaining. I nodded slowly, letting the silence fill the space between us. She waited, hoping I'd jump in with an offer, a fix, maybe even an apology. I said nothing. Finally, her voice broke. Look, we know you built it. I didn't realize, when we changed your locks, I didn't know you were still maintaining the system, that you had access. I met her eyes, calm and steady. You didn't ask. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. No excuses came. Just the quiet realization that she'd picked a fight without understanding her opponent. You kicked me out of my own house, I said, using a tool I designed. You weaponized it without knowing how it worked. Carla looked down. We made a mistake. I let the silence stretch again, then finally offered, I can restore access. But some things need to change. And this time she nodded. Not as a president, but as someone who finally understood the limits of her power. The next board meeting was different. No gavel slams, no smug declarations, no power plays. Just quiet acknowledgement. Carla opened the session with a formal apology, not just to me, but to the community. She called it a misstep in communication and process, but everyone knew what it really was. A public admission that the board had overreached and been humbled by their own ignorance. My access was restored the same evening I met with Carla. Technically, I had never lost it, but I re-enabled their user accounts, rebuilt their front-end interface to include clearer controls, and removed the hidden fallback access I'd kept tucked away. Not because I had to, but because I wanted them to feel like they were part of the system again, on fair terms this time. The neighborhood responded in kind. Neighbors who'd never spoken to me before now waved when they passed. A few dropped by with thank you notes, homemade cookies, even an offer to co-host the next community barbecue, which I politely declined. I wasn't looking for fame. I just wanted peace, and now I had it. The board quietly updated the bylaws a week later, adding explicit clauses about resident access rights and limitations on unilateral lock changes. They even added a technical advisor seat to the board, offered to me without a second thought. I declined that too, suggesting they rotate a few of the more tech-savvy residents instead. They agreed. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. Power doesn't always lie in authority. It lies in understanding. And when you understand the system better than anyone else, you don't have to raise your voice to be heard. You simply wait for the moment they realize they're standing on a foundation you built. That night, as I sat on my porch with the soft glow of the solar lights flickering along my flower bed, the same ones that once sparked the war, I let the silence wrap around me again. The system was calm. The house was mine. And respect, hard-earned and quiet as a whispered password, now unlocked every door that mattered.